Welcome to DEED's Workforce Center webinar training, Veteran Employment Program Office. Today's training is Refocus Veterans Program, Workforce Center Staff Responsibilities. My name is Lisa Snyder. I work for DEED in the Workforce Systems Coordination Office, and I will facilitate today's webinar. I have with me today Jim Finley, the Director for DEED's Veteran Employment Program, and Gary Quartermorn, the Supervisor for the Veterans Program. Today's training goals covers changes to the program, Part 1 and Part 2 webinars, referrals in staff roles and responsibilities, the new questionnaire form, resources, and a Q&A throughout the webinar and at the end of the session. I'll turn this over to Jim Finley and he'll get us started.
Good morning, everybody. We're going to get into some specific roles and responsibilities in just a minute, but maybe first take a minute to review why we're even doing this. Minnesota population is about 8% veteran or military, which means about 92% are civilian. Even though everyone has the opportunity to serve, only about 8% of the population decided to. And as a matter of fact, right now, currently, only about 1% of the U.S. population is serving. We want to honor our military members who have fought for our freedoms. The other reason for doing this webinar is to refocus roles and responsibilities of Veterans Employment staff and Workforce Center staff, because there's going to be some new things here for Workforce Center staff too. And finally, to remember that we never leave anyone behind, especially veterans, and we want to make sure that they're getting the services and made available resources that they deserve. In the past, Veterans Employment programs served most of the vets that came into the Workforce Centers. A few years ago, Department of Labor decided that Veterans Employment reps, specifically DEVOPs, needed to spend more time working with veterans that had barriers to employment. And so there was a bit of a shift a few years ago. The focus for DEVOPs was that they serve veterans, been out of work for a long time, disabled veterans, and a few other categories that we'll cover in a little while. And that the rest of those veterans would get services through the regular Workforce Center system, specifically Wagner-Pizer or job service staff and WIA staff. The background of this, again, started a few years ago and is focusing on the needs of veterans with significant barriers to employment.
So this is Gary speaking. There are going to be changes then directed from the Department of Labor, and those changes are important for our partners to understand and to know, so there is not confusion about what is happening. So in a nutshell, our DEVOPs will be more selective in the veterans they serve, which then therefore means that our VETS grant, our Jobs for Vets state grant, will serve fewer veterans and provide them with higher rates of intensive services. They're just going to be spending more time with the veterans that are designated with significant barriers to employment. All veterans with no significant barriers to employment should receive the same service as a universal customer, but priority of service should be in place for those veterans.
Now we're going to have an opportunity to use the chat box. Based on what Gary just said, answer this question: what does this mean for the Workforce Centers now? Veterans may need to be screened more prior to referring to a VETS rep. Yeah, that's actually a great answer. Another one, different identification of veterans?
The fact of the matter is that in Minnesota and in most states, we don't require veterans to actually prove that they're a veteran. They refer to that as self-attestation. They attest that they're veterans, and so then we go down this trail of trying to identify if they've got significant barriers or not. So the identification process of a veteran really won't change. If they come up to the front desk or into a resource room and say that they're a veteran, then we're going to treat them as a veteran unless we find out otherwise somehow.
We've had some disappointed veterans in the changes due to less support.
Well, I think in maybe a response to that, less support might be taking place possibly because the resource area folks may not be aware of all the resources that the VETS rep and the DEVOP have. And so it would be important then to have your little powwows, if you want to call it that, on all of the resources available to veterans.
I think the other thing that we need to keep in mind is kind of some history here. Veterans are used to walking into a workforce center asking to see a vets rep. They get to do that, and nobody's ever questioned that. The reason behind this, remember, is because there are veterans that are out there with significant barriers to employment, and we're going to actually list all of those. It's a finite list, a short list, that really need the help of DVOPs, Disabled Veterans Outreach Program Specialists, which are going to go deeper with the veterans that they talk to. And there is a great camaraderie and brotherhood and sisterhood amongst veterans, and I think the bottom line is once veterans understand that we're doing this to provide their brothers and sisters that really need it the most more intensive help, I think they're going to understand this. And priority of service is Public Law 107-288. It dictates that veterans go first. There are limited seats in a workshop. Veterans get those seats. If there's limited money in a dislocated worker program, then typically veterans get to go first. So as long as we're practicing priority of service, I think we're going to be in good shape. Most veterans that come into your workforce centers are fully able to work with the resources that are available outside of the DVOP services. Most veterans come back from service and they are ready to hit the ground running. One of the reasons they make a big deal about this is because they're used to being able to go in and see a vets rep. But that, again, according to the new law, we just can't do that. We've got to free up the time of that DVOP to be able to provide really intensive services to the ones that need it most.
A couple responses pretty much reinforces what you just said. In the resource room, we need to refer differently. Yeah, that's right. The referral process will change. That workforce center folks will have to work more with the veteran. Unfortunately, no Wagner, Peisner, or job service people work in Austin, Albert Lee, or Owatonna. Do we have?
And in that case, it's going to be WIA staff, probably dislocated worker staff. One of the things, one of the themes that's going to come up in this, or one of the thoughts, is that workforce centers should be identifying a designated intensive services staff person. There's some training that we're going to talk about that's online, that's sponsored by University of Colorado at Denver, that all the veterans employment reps go to. And the thought is that if each workforce center has somebody that's been identified as an intensive services provider in the event that a veteran walks into a workforce center and there is no vets rep available, there is no DVOP available. So workforce centers, we're all going to have to, again, work as a team on this. And the suggestion that we have is that workforce centers identify an intensive services person that's in the wings for a veteran that needs intensive services, but the DVOP is not available.
Are the vets being told of this change in the law at the meetings offered when they are re-entering the workforce?
At this stage of the game, they aren't. And actually, that's a great idea. Thanks for whoever sent that in. We will talk to the UI folks for their sessions and also talk to job service and WSA managers for the ones that do orientation sessions for the workforce center. That will help.
So moving on to the two parts to this training. Part one is, of course, is what we're working on today. Right now, we're working with the reception and resource area staff, talking about your roles and the responsibilities, the new questionnaire, the referral and flow chart process, resources that are available and resources that you need to consider for your workforce center, and that's being covered today. And as Jim had mentioned, and Gary, part two is for the non-veteran partner staff, and that's for the intensive service partners, and they will provide the intensive services and the resources and case management. That will be a webinar later on, and those folks will go through that training.
But it is kind of a two-pronged approach. We're trying to make sure that the front end of this is sound right now, that as veterans walk into the workforce center, that we get them going in the right direction. And that's why we're spending so much time on this piece with resource room staff and with front desk staff, because you guys are really the tip of the spear. You're the first contact. You are the ones that are going to be administering that questionnaire and making a decision looking at that based on the answers. Do they need to see a DVOP or the intensive services person in the event a DVOP is not there, or are they going out to universal services to the resource room where they'll get an explanation of resources available there?
So we have a question here. What do Disabled Veteran Outreach Program representatives and local veteran employment representatives do for people who have served in the military?
So those are the DVOPs and the leavers. So we'd like to see what you know about them already. Go ahead and enter in there what you know about these two titles. Case management type services to ensure referrals are made to their local services. The leaver is an employer contact versus DVOP is intensive services. Good. Let's see. Leavers will work directly with employers. Very good. Cindy, let's see. Both can provide support services to veterans. Leavers don't know. Leavers, don't know. Okay, and then we have not sure. Great responses. So now we have the opportunity to actually find out what they do.
So let's talk a little bit about the DVOP role first. A DVOP's primary responsibility is to provide intensive services to veterans with significant barriers to employment. They do not provide services to any other population. The LVER role conducts employer outreach and job development in the local community on behalf of all American Job Center veterans. They do not provide direct services to participants or to veterans. That's the roles in a nutshell.
Based on what Gary just said, we have a polling question. So if a DVOP or a non-veteran representative is unavailable to meet with a military member, should you contact the leaver? A, no, B, unsure, or C, yes. 73% no, you do not refer the military member to a leaver, and we had 2%, or 4% rather, unsure, and 5% said yes. So what do you think about that, Jim, Gary?
Again, this is kind of one of the main themes that's going to run through this whole process is that DVOPs are the only ones that provide services to veterans with significant barriers to employment. And I know this creates a problem for some of the workforce centers because they don't have a DVOP on staff, or they don't have a DVOP on staff every day. That's where that designated intensive services person comes in. LVERs, by law, by this new statute, will never be providing intensive services to a veteran with significant barriers to employment or any other veteran. The mission of the LVER is to be connecting with employers on behalf of the veterans that are on the caseload of the DVOP. DVOPs are getting those veterans with significant barriers to employment ready for the work search, getting their resume ready, helping them work through other obstacles, and LVERs are the ones contacting businesses to develop opportunities for them. And then in addition, LVERs are also responsible for helping you all in the workforce centers stay up with kind of the changing playing field on this whole thing. Also educating businesses on the value veterans bring to a business.
We have another part to this question. If a DVOP or a non-veteran representative is unavailable to meet with a military member, should you contact a leaver? And of course we said no. If not, then what should you do?
One other thing that I'd like to mention, we had a question come in a little while ago. Who's responsible for making sure there is an intensive services person in a workforce center? And that is actually going to be that workforce center manager. The hope is that there would be some coordination between partner management, that at some point they would get together and identify somebody who's going to be that go-to person when the DVOP is either not in the office or there's not a DVOP assigned to that workforce center. But it's critical that somebody is identified so there's not a mad scramble, and also that identified person has had an opportunity to go through some training. It's again via webinar with NVTI on providing services to veterans, so they will kind of become that subject matter expert in lieu of a DVOP. But it actually does fall to the management of that workforce center to identify somebody. We will not be pointing anybody out. we hope that you'll all identify somebody locally.
Good, thank you for that, Jim. Most had answered it correctly, is refer him or her to a designated service provider.
Part of the problem that we're going to encounter on this is as staff change over and they haven't had an opportunity to go through this training, or staff that might fill in at the front desk or in the resource for whatever reason. I can't see a vets rep. How could that happen, since a Workforce Center staff person referred me to a veterans representative? So this really is all about making sure that everybody's on top of these changes, and the idea that DevOps will really only be seeing veterans that have significant barriers to employment. There was a training employment guidance letter that went out, 19-13, that explains all of this information on current law, but it does explain the distinction between a DevOP and an LVER, and in there it talks about this partner staff person who would be identified to provide intensive services in lieu of the DevOP. This is all going to start with that assessment, so we want to make sure that everybody is using that questionnaire. We want to make sure that the questionnaire is not compromised. I know a lot of workforce centers have been using this questionnaire over the last probably 3 years, and there's probably about a dozen different iterations of it out there. Some workforce centers have added questions to it to try to also identify dislocated workers and eligibility for other programs. DOL is requiring us to develop this questionnaire, and that it has to be very specific to significant barriers to employment. And again, all those barriers are listed on that questionnaire.
For the workforce centers that don't have DevOP, those individuals need to get a hold of myself and Jim Finley, and we'll work closely with you.
I don't know how often you'll run into this situation, and hopefully before you do, maybe as Gary mentioned earlier, you'll have a chance to get together with the management, the workforce center, the site representatives, and talk about, okay, now that we've gone through this training, who is, if we don't have a DevOP here, who is the person designated as the intensive service provider? And that's a conversation you have to take back with your workforce center.
That's a great point, Lisa. We don't expect the numbers are going to be really large with this. But it's all about being prepared ahead of time. So again, we avoid a scramble when a veteran with significant barriers comes in and the DevOps is not available. Actually, as just kind of a side note too, any program that gets its funding from the Department of Labor, which includes all WIA programs, includes the Job Service Wagner-Pizer program, includes actually the huge majority of programs in the Workforce Center, are required to provide intensive services to veterans when they sign their grant. But all programs receiving DOL funding in whole or in part are required to provide priority of service and intensive services to veterans that come into they call them now American Job Centers, we call them in Minnesota Workforce Centers.
There's a couple of questions that I want to go ahead and ask now. Was this letter sent to all service providers outside of state and county?
I believe the letter was sent to anybody that gets DOL funding. But yes, those letters should have gone out not only to all workforce centers, but to all service providers that get any kind of funding from DOL. As workforce center representatives, what can we do to ensure that military members have been referred to the appropriate resources?
So actually the new question is, how have you felt when you have been referred incorrectly?
So in other words, when they're out getting any kind of service, any place, whether it's a doctor or at Sears, right, how do you feel when somebody sends you in the wrong direction or down the wrong aisle?
Absolutely, and I'm sure that's happened to everybody a few times. So we can see by the poll results, we have one individual, this is not a problem. That's a great attitude. But I'd say for the most part, a lot of you feel disregarded or disrespected or angry, and quite a few of you feel both disregarded, disrespected, and angry. So yeah, so when you've been referred to the wrong place, maybe you've been sitting on the phone for an hour and a half, we've all been there, at least I know I have a few times. It doesn't feel good when then you're referred to the wrong department or the wrong person and you got to sit on the phone again. And so that's just waste of time, waste of money. Maybe you're anxious, you want to get this moving, and so now you're even delayed. So that's something, and the reason why we wanted to include that this question in here is because this is something that has happened to the vets in the past when they've been referred to a vet's rep, and they weren't screened properly.